Welcome officially to the Guidelines for Local Surveys CLG Training session. We are going to be going over a NPS National Register Bulletin, which is a basis for preservation planning. And we're going through the first part, which is planning the survey. This gives some really good background on what surveys are, how they can be used, different definitions that are important. And like I was saying earlier, is going to be part one of a multiple part series that we will continue doing to go deeper into this. The next session will hopefully involve Casey Woster, our National Register Coordinator, and we'll be talking about our upgraded survey and inventory forms that you can use. You just need to do a little more to make sure that they meet all the standards in the state. Okay. Let's see. Yay. Okay, so what we're talking about today is a National Register of Historic Places bulletin. And these are a series of publications that the Park Service has put out over the years. And they are about topics that relate to the National Register of Historic Places. You can see one of the first ones was how to apply the National Register criteria for evaluation. And they have these on a multitude of topics. For the least original bulletins, they had a tagline that said, technical information on the comprehensive planning, survey of cultural resources, and registration in the National Register of Historic Places. And so that was their original purpose. I'm not going to read all this, don't worry. This, and then the next slide, you can see all of the bulletins that they have put out, and there are a good number of them that have existed over the years. This first link is very important. It gets you access to almost all of the bulletins online, and these are incredible guidance. They're still used, even the older ones, for basically the basis of preservation writing and planning in the US. And we'll be talking about the first one, guidelines for local surveys. But you can see it's got everything from shipwrecks to rural historic landscapes, historic aviation properties, and more. The most recently released was documenting traditional cultural properties. And then there are a couple that you have to actually request access for. I put those noted down there. But if you're coming up on an issue and you need additional information, this is the best place to start. And here it is. It says Survey 24, the National Register Bulletin Guidelines for Local Surveys. Apparently, they stopped using the numbering system at some point, so we'll just be referring to it as Guidelines for Local Surveys. It was originally published in 1977 and revised in 1985. There were a lot of updates to the National Historic Preservation Act in 1980 that it needed to address in the newer edition. And in the actual forward, it says its purpose is to provide further assistance to communities and local governments' conduct of high-quality surveys. The National Register has prepared guidelines for local surveys, a basis for preservation planning. This bulletin is intended to provide a wide range of information on identifying, registering, and protecting historic resources. So this is the basis of what we will be talking about today, and what will hopefully form the backbone of our survey work going forward. So one of the first questions come to mind is why do a historic resource survey? What purpose do they serve? They answer that pretty quickly in the bulletin. The immediate reason for a historic resource survey is to gather information needed to plan for the wise use of the community's resources. Basically, if you don't know what you have, you won't be able to properly plan to protect it. Historic resource surveys and the resulting inventories form an important basis for planning decisions that affect the quality of community life. In order to plan for the preservation and enhancement of the historic environment, it is necessary to determine what properties make up that environment. Surveys also help identify properties that contribute to the community's character, or that of its neighborhoods, or that illustrate historical and architectural development, and as a result deserve consideration in planning. This can also help you figure out future National Register nominations or districts that you may be interested in pursuing. It also helps to establish preservation priorities for your commission or board to focus on, allowing you to be more effective in where you spend your time and energy, because it can just feel overwhelming, the number of different projects that can be pulling you in every direction. And so just knowing what you have, it can give you basically a little bit of peace of mind, and you can go through that and really decide, okay, here's what's most at risk. We can focus here first. Because again, you're all a volunteer board, and so using your time efficiently is important. And then before we keep getting deeper into this, just a couple of definitions that will help us. Talking about historic surveys, they are essentially the documentation of cultural resources, which are defined by the Park Service as buildings, sites, structures, objects, and districts. And they also go more into depth in that in the actual bulletin. There's a long extended definitions and also examples given. And this historic survey is the basis for all other preservation activities. So again, they very much emphasize its importance. To get more general, survey, the process of identifying and gathering data on a community's historic resources. Field survey, the physical search for and recording of historic resources on the ground. Survey data, raw data produced by the survey, that is, all the information gathered on each property and area investigated. Inventory, basic product of a survey, an organized compilation of information on those properties that are evaluated as significant. And then evaluation, the process of determining whether identified properties meet defined criteria of historical, architectural, archaeological, or cultural significance. And we'll go into it a little further down, but this is where you get into the need for SOI, Secretary of Interior standards, qualifications for individuals, since they are the only ones able to make these evaluations. All right, now we're going to go a little deeper into the types of surveys. And the first one we're going to talk about is a reconnaissance survey, which is described as a once-over lightly inspection of an area, most useful for characterizing its resources in general, and for developing a basis for deciding how to organize and orient more detailed survey efforts. So this is almost always where you will begin, unless you already have a determined survey area. This helps to kind of create the boundaries, the limit, give you an idea of what historic resources are in the area before you really start doing the deep dive into the research. And they talk about a couple of activities you can do for resource surveys. These include windshield surveys, so driving around the community and noting the distribution of buildings, architectural styles, periods of history. So really, you're just driving by and taking notes on what you see and areas of interest, essentially. Walkovers are archaeological inspections, sometimes coupled with small-scale excavations to get a general idea of an archaeological potential of portions of the community. And then an aerial photography study. So historical and recent maps of your community, city plans, soil surveys, and more can help gain a general understanding of the community's layout and environment at different times in history. So it can show you which neighborhoods have developed more recently. You can do a windshield survey of an area that you identified on with aerial photography to see the number of buildings in that neighborhood that remain. So again, this is the place to start, and it is a great foundation for your surveys. The next level up is intensive surveys. And the National Park Service describes them as a close and careful look at the area being surveyed. It is designed to identify precisely and completely all historic resources in an area. It generally involves detailed background research and a thorough inspection and documentation of all historic properties in the field. It should produce all the information needed to evaluate historic properties and prepare an inventory. So this information is about as in-depth as you can get. If you have a downtown district nomination, this is the type of information that you would be using in that nomination. This takes a lot more research, time, and effort, and that's why it's good to use the reconnaissance surveys to make sure you're focusing on the resources that you need to. And after looking at these two types of surveys, where should you start your survey? The bulletin puts forward a couple of questions that you should ask before starting a survey, such as what kind of resources should the survey seek? And here we get into the building, site, structure, object, or district, which the brief gives 3 whole pages about. And this can just help determine the different types of resources you're looking at. For some, it could be rail cars. For others, it will be neighborhood buildings. And then what kinds of information should be gathered? And this is for each type of survey. For reconnaissance surveys, you're looking for specific properties that were identified and the categories of information collected. So it's more general. You have a certain set of categories you're looking at, like say the age of the building, its appearance, how many stories it is, things like that. And those will be those categories. And then again, you need to know which properties you looked at. Intensive surveys are information on the appearance, significance, integrity, and boundaries of each property sufficient to permit an evaluation of its significance. So in this case, again, talking about the National Register of Historic Places. And very, very thorough research will be done. And the next question to ask is, how large an area should be included in your survey? Oftentimes, city and county limits are what will define the survey area. You can only go so far within your jurisdiction. Historic contexts and public interest could also help define a survey area. So if a particular neighborhood has expressed interest in learning more about their community, that could be a really good place to start. If you know you have a lot of sheep herders in a particular area historically, then you could look into those areas to survey. And if you're going for an entire community, these surveys will often need to be broken down into pieces. And so you'll also have to decide what order you want to go in to slowly work your way at the whole. For how long a survey will take, it is a very much it depends answer. And what it depends on is the size of your survey area, the number of surveyors you have involved, and the depth and amount of information to be gathered. So this will kind of be the reconnaissance versus intensive. How deep are you going with this research? And as it suggests with the above surveys being broken down, there are a couple different ways to do that. You can approach it in an area by area process, where you break it into phases, where a set amount of the survey area is completed before another area is started. So you'll choose between a couple streets, do all the houses there, and then move on to the next on like a grid. Phased survey is another alternative in which the background research and reconnaissance of the community is completed first, followed by an intensive survey. And from the bulletin, it does seem like they recommend this, at least on a general level. It is very good to get some limited background research done before you start your survey, just to make sure your resources are being used efficiently. And once you decide, once you go through these questions, then you'll need to also decide your survey's purpose. And it can be a bit of a challenge, but the National Park Service has some recommendations on where you can start looking for these priorities. And some of them are easier, such as if you don't have a downtown, like Main Street district nomination, that's a great place to start. It tends to have a high density of historic buildings, and so it can be easier to get all of that done in a efficient sort of way. If there's a well-preserved historic neighborhood, that could be something to look into. If you know a lot of the houses are original, then you're not going to have to be sifting out a whole lot of non-contributing resources. And so, yeah, great place to start if you don't have those surveys done already. And they, again, repeat that they really encourage starting with preliminary research and doing a windshield survey of the selected community to get a general idea of a community's historic resources before deciding whether or not to do more intensive surveys. Because it could end up that even though you thought there was a lot of original homes, they'd actually been replaced, or a number of demolitions have occurred. And it's just good to be there and get your eyes on everything so that you can really know what's going on and decide where to go from there. The next one is about redevelopment. If there are certain areas of your community that are likely to be heavily redeveloped or are already in the process of being redeveloped, there may be particular resources that need to be protected in those communities. And even if they can't be protected, documenting them before they're demolished or heavily altered can be a very helpful way to ensure this information is given to future generations. It could also spark interest in some of these buildings, which could help protect them as well. And then one of the, in my opinion, best ways to go is if the residents of a neighborhood or commercial area are interested in their history, in their buildings, enhancing their properties, then it's a great place to start because you'll have all that community backing and they'll be the ones advocating and supporting the project as you go. And whenever possible, this is the best place to start. And you can also encourage this by telling people about the history of their community and getting them interested. So yeah, here's some places to start when deciding on what you'd like to focus your surveys on. The next section of the bulletin goes into historic contexts, and I'm going to use it to mostly talk about the historic contexts that we have available at the State Historic Preservation Office, because I'm not sure if everyone is aware of the number of publications that we have. To explain why we're talking about historic contexts, first we'll define them. Historic context is a broad pattern of historical development in a community or its region that may be represented by historic resources. And in the bulletin, the Park Service emphasizes that historic contexts need to be taken into account when starting a survey to prevent the use of ineffective survey methods, failure to identify historic resources, or biased selections. Some of the examples they give are, if you're going to need to be looking at more archaeological resources, you want to make sure you're bringing in those sorts of professionals. If you need people looking at architecture, bring in those professionals. If you know there was a flood in a particular time, it can be a good idea to look at certain aspects. It's the same sort of, especially in boom and bust cycle of Wyoming. You can know that during the 1890s, this is when your town grew significantly. So that's a time period you may want to focus on. I'm going to show you guys on our website the different historic contexts that we have. And let me go ahead and share the screen with you. Here we go. So these are our thematic contexts that we have. There are a number of them. They are available to download for free on our website. You can find them under Programs, Planning and History, Thematic Contexts, and I've provided the link as well in the presentation. There are a number of different topics that they cover, from the Wyoming military historic context in the 1920s to the I think that's 30s. The Paleo-Indian Heartland is the most recent one that was released this year. There's one called Places of Learning, which is about educational institutions in Wyoming. And these are very thorough, very in-depth resources. And you can take a look at them and see where your particular community is mentioned. And that can be a very good place to look because they've already done the research for you. and then it's a great springboard. After that, we have historic period multiple property documents. And we have a number of these available for download as well, and then some updated ones too. These are, again, on specific topics such as post office, Yellowstone National Park, trading posts in Wyoming. One of the more recent ones is auto landscapes and tourism. So if you're looking into a topic that might involve one of these things, like public schools in Wyoming, this is where you should go. It will give you information that's been done by our office and professionals that they have hired to really delve into these topics. And these are some of the best resources that you can have because they're specific, they're about Wyoming, and again, they're in depth. You might not need them quite as often, but also prehistoric multiple property documents. And so this can be about specific sites, such as Paleo-Indian archaeology in Wyoming. And yeah, so we have all these resources that you can just download. We have old publications, contextual information, so they'll talk about the fur trade or the oil industry. And this is the sort of background that the Park Service is asking you to consider before you start your survey and while you are doing it, to make sure you're not missing out on certain parts of history that could mean you're overlooking particular buildings or something. So yes, please look in our planning and historic context section of our website. Again, programs, it's then down to planning and historic context, and then you can see the different publications that we have available. And I highly recommend them. They are just so incredibly helpful. All right. And now we will get back to our presentation. The next aspect, and they kind of got into it when talking about involving neighborhoods, is how to involve the public in your survey work. It will always be more successful if you get local interest and involvement and support, not only just because of the people involved, but it can kind of become a rallying point. And if there's any sort of pushback from, say, local government officials, the people will be the ones to speak out and say, no, this is something that they want. This happened a lot for sure in Laramie with their West Side Historic District. It was the neighborhood who really wanted to get this done, and so they spoke a number of times to their local officials, and it helped greatly in getting it accomplished. The Park Service recommends getting the public involved in the early stages of planning a survey, especially for those who live in the survey area. You don't want it to come as a surprise, but also they can help in finding you resources. There can be oral histories and stories that you receive that can help inform your research. And they may just be interested in getting involved in the process of the survey. Also, if you can, contacting local historical organizations, neighborhood groups, archaeological or architectural societies, those would all be fantastic places to look for help, whether that be in research or just in giving you advice on their research in the area. So maybe they can give you some background you wouldn't know about otherwise. A place for volunteers to come from potentially as well. If you can, and it can be hard since you're doing the research as you go, but doing a survey of the area, doing a tour of the survey area is a really good way to increase public interest. Even if you only have, pieces, you can focus on the houses that you've already researched. And I found that doing these local tours really helps people connect with their community. And once you complete the survey, you can use the information you've collected to do something even more in depth and make sure people appreciate all the research and time and effort that you've put in. And make information available about the survey in public places such as libraries and museums, wherever you can put down a flyer in a place where people might be interested. And do this throughout the process, both for the start, if people want to get involved in the survey early, and then also throughout. And once you've completed the survey, make sure to make that information available as well. People will be interested to see what you've learned. And like with the West Side District in Laramie, community interest can help with recruiting volunteers for historic research and field survey work. This will be something we'll go into more in depth in the next presentation in this series. But we are creating survey forms and inventory forms that you are going to be able to use, and they should be simple enough to use that you can have volunteers filling out the information, and they can work with you for these surveys. You will not need necessarily a professional, someone with those SOA qualifications. And this is a great way for people to get involved in their community. The last one is the NPS just gives a little bit of, I'd say it's a warning, to make sure that the communities that you will be in know that you are coming and what you're doing. So they know that you will be there with a survey team, and you can tell them you'll be collecting information about the style of the houses or the number of stories, you know, that sort of stuff that's on the survey form, so that they know it's not just strangers showing up in their neighborhood, and when they see you, they can talk to you about it instead of being uncertain on why you're in the area. So again, communication, so important for all of this. The last section is going into a little bit about kind of more of the intensive surveys, where you may need to hire consultants, and where you may need funding as well. So, as we've discussed earlier, intensive surveys will require the involvement of an SOI qualified individual to ensure accuracy and professional quality. And you can see the link here, and we'll also just go and take a look at that real fast. The professional qualifications standards. Just a moment. Let's see. And you don't need to have these memorized already. It's just something good to be familiar with. So they have written out what is in the original publication in Code of Federal Regulations, 36 CFR, Part 61. Essentially, what you need to know for most of these qualifications in history, archaeology, architectural history, and more, is it tends to require a graduate degree, or a bachelor's degree plus some additional experience. So in history, 2 years of full-time experience in research, writing, teaching, interpretation, or other demonstrable professional activity with an academic institution, historical organization, or agency, museum, or other professional institution, or contributions to research and publication of scholarly knowledge in the field of history. Again, it changes a little bit for each. You can see that archaeology has 3 different options, but lots of them are talking about at least research writing experience. So these, you might have individuals within your community that are SOI qualified, but it can be a good idea to potentially hire other folks, since not every community is going to have an SOI qualified individual. And also, you know, they could potentially get burnt out in doing all of the research for it. So once again, it's just something good to be familiar with that is on the Park Service website. There we go. Of course, if you want to bring in someone who is qualified in this way, there will be an additional cost. So if you are factoring the budget to, say, apply for a certified local government grant, just make sure to factor in those fees. SHPO has a list of consultants, and I think the Alliance for Historic Wyoming is also working on a list. SHPO cannot make recommendations on who you go with, however. Something I recommend is if you have, and reach out to me and I can let you know about this too, but if other CLGs have recently done survey work, I can put you in contact with them, or you can just reach out to them and see how the process went, whether they like the consultant, and this can help a great deal when it comes to kind of narrowing down your choices or even knowing who to send the ask out to. And then as far as funding goes, like I said, certified local government grants are available to fund historic resource surveys. This can be for both the reconnaissance and intensive surveys. Reconnaissance is a lot easier to use volunteers to gather the basic information, but you can pair them together. The timing is somewhat difficult, but to provide in-kind match for CLG grants. Essentially, the reason the timing could be hard is you need to make sure the volunteer time comes after you have received the grant. Otherwise, it will not count towards the in-kind match. But just know this is something that you can do. You'll be using the Wyoming volunteer rate to calculate that. Each survey is going to cost a different amount, and it'll be affected by many factors such as time, the size of the survey area, and the depth of the information to be gathered. And then the number of people that you will be involving as well. This is part one of many parts. I just didn't want to overwhelm everyone. Like the Park Service said, this is the basis for most historic preservation, and so I want to make sure to give the topic the time it deserves. So later on, we will be discussing the second part of the bulletin, actually conducting the survey. And this is when Cassandra Worcester, our National Register Coordinator, will be involved. She'll talk about her experience doing surveys, and we'll give you our updated form at that time as well that you'll be able to use for the survey work. And again, that's kind of the potentially second or connected topic. We'll see how it ends up. One of the other things that we are currently working on is a inventory form, and trying to see if there's a way for us to host it in a way that is accessible for everyone. And we will get to you with that once we know that we have the proper permissions in place, once we have the form refined. Some other interesting topics that I'd really love to go into: how to research historic buildings. I'm hoping to bring in the archives, the state archives for that, hopefully, since they have a really good guide online, and this can help with the research that you do. And something Casey Worcester is also working on is Wyoming architectural styles. We do have some publications that have been written about this, but we just want to further clarify the information, and it's going to be an ongoing topic that she's working on. Might be something we discuss at future conferences as well. All right, I'll make sure that you can all unmute yourselves. If you'd like to ask any questions, I'll go ahead and end the recording here. Thank you so much for attending.